Okay. In the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push ahead with the rest of what I want to say, and then we'll open it up for some questions at the end of this. But I want to go, because what I've done so far, I hope, is I have laid the groundwork for this alternative lexicon. And now what I want to do is I want to present what this alternative lexicon, or an alternative lexicon, would look like. And I should say, by slight way of, I guess, minor self-promotion, I guess I'm allowed to do that. I'm a presenter, right? A lot of this comes from a book that is being finished right now and will be actually published by Routledge at some point in the spring. It's actually called The Conduct of Inquiry in International Relations. They wanted an IR book, but it is much more broadly applicable. It's only called IR because of the market, and they want me to use some IR examples, so I use some examples from international relations. But I also end up pulling in quite a few examples from comparative politics. I tried really hard to think of examples from American politics to pull in and was unable to do so. So instead, I end up basically being a sort of an IR comparative book. And there's plenty of philosophy. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about here, obviously in a somewhat abbreviated form, are done in considerably more detail in the book. The book has been written largely to function as, in the first instance, kind of a graduate textbook, and then also as a kind of primer or refresher for people who want to figure some of these things out. It's being taught in draft form at the moment by a couple of people at the graduate level, so the book exists. I'm happy to talk to people more about this once I finish writing the conclusion, which is what I'm writing right now. So anyway, a lot of this sort of comes from that, looking at this kind of more adequate lexicon. So what do I mean? What kind of lexicon do I think I have? Well, the lexicon that I have in mind here, again, is going to get us down to this level of methodology. In order to illustrate what I mean, I want to start off by calling attention to a couple of things in Hempel and making sure that we are all on the same page with respect to Karl Popper, who we might have heard of, but I want to just make, there's one particular point that's drawn from Popper that's kind of important here. So Hempel, who we all read, we took a look at this essay of his. This is a sort of celebrated essay of Hempel's. There's obviously others that he wrote and other members of his circle wrote. But this one in particular is useful because it's one of the few where Hempel tries to specifically address the non-natural sciences and to really take up the question of what would explanation look like in somewhere outside of physics, somewhere outside of these things. And from Hempel, I think we can derive a couple of basic kinds of positions that Hempel takes. One of them is that all explanations for him have to take the form of and involve law-like generalizations, right? To explain means to ultimately talk about what law is being involved in a particular situation, what's being specifically invoked in that situation. If it's not that, then it is, in the lovely term that he uses, an explanation sketch, which is to say an approximation to a law-like generalization, which is ultimately what he wants to do. And the other thing that I want to call attention to in Hempel is the fact that for Hempel, knowledge is wrapped up with observation. We look at stuff, we observe things, we measure them, we count them. That's where knowledge comes from. If you ever hear anyone in political science or anywhere else talking about a conceptual issue and say, that's just a measurement problem, they are channeling the ghost of Hempel. Because of this idea that everything can be reduced to a measurement problem, this is a specific kind of logical positivist position. Now, what's weird is that in the field of political science, we actually are not, for the most part, Hempelians. We actually have another thing that is animating our research design questions, which derives from Karl Popper, and specifically Popper's critique of Vienna Circle positivism. And the main lesson that everybody draws from Popper, it's easy to do with Popper because he repeats it ad infinitum on virtually every page of everything that he ever wrote, that knowledge comes not from observation, but from successive hypothesis testing. That knowledge is, in fact, something that we generate not by looking at stuff, but, in fact, by engaging in this process of falsification. We throw out a conjecture, we compare it to what's going on in the world, we see if the conjecture stands up. If it can't be falsified, it's not science. How many times have we heard that, philosophically detached from any particular context? But this is this Popperian understanding. Interestingly, the reason I have to mention Popper at this point, why we can't just do this with Hempel, that's not what Hempel thinks demarcates science from non-science. What Hempel thinks demarcates science from non-science is empirical, not falsifiable. Hempel's all about verifying, not about falsifying. But if you said that what you were trying to do in your work was going out and verify stuff, people probably wouldn't hear it that way in the contemporary discipline of political science because falsification is much more how we set things up these days. In fact, I would go so far as to say that what we now have in political science is a kind of Hempel-Popper blend, where what we end up with is, from Hempel, the emphasis on nomothetic explanation, that if you got a nomothetic generalization, you're doing explanation, you're doing good science, that's how it works. If you don't, you're getting close to that, you're helping out. Think, for instance, in comparative politics of all of the endless debates and hand-wringing about single case studies and about what they're good for. And of course the answer is, oh, they're really good because they can provide an extra test of a general hypothesis, right? So crucial cases are because why are they crucial? They're crucial in terms of a generalization, right? So we have all of these debates about this. We get that nomothetic thing from Hempel. From Popper, right? From Popper, what we end up with is falsification. Again, ad infinitum. This idea that what we're supposed to do is falsify our claims. Now, sustaining those claims, I think, are a pair of philosophical commitments that we don't often foreground. But the vocabulary that I want to introduce is going to be about foregrounding these claims and foregrounding them in such a way that we understand that there are alternatives to these philosophical claims. So what sustains this emphasis on nomothetic explanation and falsification? Well, I think in the first instance, what sustains it is a claim that there is such a thing as a mind-independent world that exists out there someplace beyond our perception of it. So there's a world that's out there. And knowledge is about coming up with some kind of representation of what that world is like. Obviously, in order to do that, logically, we have to assume that there is a world out there and it has a way that it is like, so that you can have better and worse representations. The whole procedure of hypothesis testing depends on this. Otherwise, there's nothing to test a hypothesis against. Right? So we have this. This may seem kind of obvious because it's so ingrained in what we do. But there is, as you'll see, some conceptual benefit to actually bringing it out into the light. The other assumption that goes into here is that we only really know stuff that we can measure. So we only know things that we can observe. We create a law-like generalization, but a law-like generalization basically is just about how observations are going to fit together. We go see if the observations actually fit together that way, and that's what we end up with. So these things implicitly support this kind of Hempel-Popper blend on falsification to reach nomothetic generalization. Mind independence of the world and knowledge as being wrapped up with and limited by the empirical. Now, these two commitments are what I refer to as wagers. These are, you might say, provisional positions. They're not provisional positions according to the philosophers who advocate them, but they're provisional positions as far as we're concerned because they're alternatives, right? But these are positions on these very likely unresolvable issue. Any of you that would like to really jump in and definitively resolve the question of whether a mind-independent world exists or not, come talk to me afterwards. And I'll show you where somebody here can show me where the theology department is, because that's big, unresolvable kinds of questions. People are wrestling about this for a long, long time. But people end up taking positions on this implicitly in terms of their research techniques. The kinds of wagers that these are, this first piece of vocabulary that I want to introduce here, is these are positions in what I would refer to as philosophical ontology. These are positions about how knowing subjects and minds are plugged into the world, how we are hooked up to the world, how we are connected to it. The mind-world dualism, which is one of them, which is the one we've been talking about the mind and the world being independent of each other, clearly envisions a certain way in which minds are plugged into the world, right? And certain channels through which knowledge of the world passes. Right? This is the reason I call this philosophical ontology is because if you look in the tradition of philosophical reflection about these things, this is clearly ontology. This is about the stuffness of stuff and the being of being, right? What it means to exist. So again, this is a little far removed from what we normally do in political science, but I think these implicitly ground the kind of work that we do. This is more fundamental than quote-unquote epistemology. Because when people use words like epistemology, which is a word I'm not fond of, they use the word epistemology in a very interesting context. Usually we talk about epistemology and we mean the problem of how a mind knows things about the world. But that already presumes that the mind is separate from the world. The very term epistemology, if you go back in the history of philosophy, the very term epistemology comes out of a whole group of people trying to wrestle with the most famous statement of mind and world being separate, which is René Descartes. You may remember from your undergraduate days, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. This idea that the mind exists and is an autonomous entity and has to figure out things about the world. The very term epistemology already makes a presumption about how we're connected to the world. That's why I don't like it. because I want to say there are other kinds of alternatives to this. To foreshadow what I'm going to say in a minute or so, when people talk about participant observation ethnography, in many ways what they are doing is they are saying minds are not separate from the world, minds participate in the world. And to separate the mind from the world is not what we're doing. Therefore, there is no epistemological problem in the classical sense, because epistemology is all wrapped up with this thing. So that's why I don't like the term. I prefer philosophical ontology. Now, as with the earlier kinds of things that we were doing, when I talk about these wagers, I'm using a kind of ideal-typical dichotomy. I'm not going to have Weber descend from the heavens again behind this slide, but you can imagine that Weber kind of lords over the whole thing. Because again, I think that what's useful with trying to define this vocabulary is that we do this in a kind of artificially pure way, because then it allows us to actually have some discussions and debates about what goes on. This is, again, this is a lexicon for asking certain kinds of questions. So that's what I've done in terms of delineating these wagers. The useful lexicon allows us to get to that methodological level. It allows us to sort of ask the right questions in ways that I think qual, quant, interpretive, explain, understand don't really get us to that level. So what are the wagers that I have in mind? Well, I've talked about them, but I will now be a little more explicit. The first of the wagers is this mind-world dualism versus the opposite, which would be mind-world monism wager. I've argued that Popper and Hempel live over on the dualism side. There's a world out there, and we're actually trying to connect with it. Knowledge mirrors or represents the world in some way. Accuracy means proper depiction. We've drawn the picture right so it corresponds. You'll sometimes see this referred to as the correspondence account of truth, the idea that you just want to get the world right. So the world's out there. It is what it is. We're trying to depict it and draw it accurately. Okay? That presumes a whole series of things. It presumes a gulf between the knower and the world that has to somehow be bridged or crossed. Right? So it sets up a particular kind of situation. Now, there is an opposite to this. There is an alternative, which is a position which we might think of as mind-world monism, which is the idea that the world does not exist separate from the knower, that the knower and the known are, in fact, parts of the same process. That when we know things, we do not know things because there's things out there that we have to sort of come to understanding of, but instead we are actually wrapped up with them. This, again, as I mentioned, is sort of participant observation. This is in many ways methodologically what they're trying to signal. The world is not out there. The world is something that we are plugged into and are actively producing by our intervention in it. Notice, if you're a monist, there's no gap to cross. Notice there's no hypothesis to falsify, because there's no world out there that could falsify a conjecture about it. There is instead only a particular fleshing out of your position within a particular set of empirics. Very different knowledge situation, right? We don't talk about that one so much. We don't talk about that one so much because we usually don't know there's an alternative to mind-world dualism. It's out there. It's been going on for hundreds of years. People have been sort of trying to flesh this out. There's all sorts of names for it. But this is one of those kinds of assumptions. Again, these are wagers. These are wagers because I don't think they're ultimately resolvable, but they do have concrete implications. Dualists like testing. Dualists like what Richard Rorty referred to as the mind being the mirror of nature, that we can represent things and we can reflect it as neutrally as possible. Monists say that's garbage. You can't do that. Every depiction of the world is itself a production or a co-production of the world. There is no simple way in which things are that you could get right, but instead by participating in it, you produce a set of defensible knowledge claims about it. Right? Methodological, not just method. This is about the way in which we're plugged into things. So if this is the first wager, there's a second wager. And the second wager, I have to introduce two more terms that may be a little unusual, but I need to introduce these terms phenomenal and transfactual in order to explain what I mean. This basically has to do with the relationship between knowledge and observability, the relationship between knowledge and experience, knowledge and the empirical world. I mentioned that Popper and Hempel both argue that our knowledge is limited by what we can see, by what we can test, by what we can perceive. This makes them, in the language I want to introduce, phenomenalists, which is a little easier to say than experientialists, which is the other term I used to use. The problem with experientialists, and this is an interesting sociological commentary on the field, when I would mention experientialist, people would hear experimentalist. Interesting, huh? That the whole way in which we do this are wrapped up with these ideas. Phenomenalist, the idea that knowledge arises from is bounded by our experiences. So if you can't measure it and you can't operationalize it, it doesn't exist, and you can't know anything about it. You hear that a lot. Interestingly, you hear that from very different kinds of people. You hear that from some kinds of statisticians. You hear that from some kinds of rational choice people. You hear that from some kinds of discourse analysts, particularly the ones that are really more enamored of Foucault than critical discourse analysis. Foucault, in fact, jokingly, half-jokingly, you never can tell with Foucault, right? But he sort of half-jokingly at one point refers to himself as a positivist, by which he means you don't know things about the deep structure of discourse, you just know things about the surface-level manifestations, which is just as phenomenalist as someone saying we only know things that we can quantitatively measure and put into a regression equation of some kind. Kind of weird to put Foucault and the correlates of war people on the same page, but in terms of this issue, they are. Not other issues, but in terms of this issue, this bounding by experience. In fact, this is one, if you read any of the literature on Foucault, this is the major critique of Foucault by people who are more structuralist. They say Foucault doesn't have any kind of deep structure of domination. There's just surface-level manifestations. But Foucault's like, yeah, that's all we have, surface-level manifestations. So this notion of limiting things to the experiential. The opposite, of course, is what I would call transfactual, which is the idea that you can grasp things that go beyond experience. Everybody who calls himself a structuralist is a transfactualist. Everybody who talks about social structures is implicitly a transfactualist, because social structures, rather famously, are not directly perceivable by the senses. They are abduced, to use the technical term. They are produced by observations and are used to explain what's going on in particular things. You can't see structures of capitalist domination. You can see their effects. You can't see gender hierarchy. You can see or patriarchy. You can see gender hierarchies, which can imply patriarchy. But you can't see the object itself because the object is beyond factuality. It gives rise to facts. It gives rise to things that you observe. Again, this is philosophical ontology or methodology. This is about the way in which we're hooked into the world. What are the things that are available for us to generate knowledge of? Right? So that's the other kind of dichotomy here. A little footnote, because sometimes you will hear this sort of strange misinterpretation that people will give. This idea that if you think that knowledge is bounded by experience, that somehow that actually means that you think knowledge is bounded by what you can perceive with your unaided senses. This is silly. This is a discussion that was actually had in philosophy for the last couple of hundred years, and people pretty definitively resolved that. To say that knowledge is bounded by what you can perceive or measure does not preclude you from using microscopes and telescopes and things like this. It is not to say that you have to be able to see it with the unaided eye. It is simply to say that you can use perception techniques to get at something, but the point is that you only know things you can actually somehow get your hands around. If you think you can know things that you can't get your hands around but only can sort of indirectly get at them through their effects, then you're not a phenomenalist, right? Then you're into the realm of the transfactual. So, two dichotomies. What can we do with those? That's right. Got to have a 2x2 table. And I think a 2x2 table, again, I think there's also symmetry here. We had bad 2x2 table in the first part. Now we're going to have good 2x2 table, in which I think that if you combine these wagers, I think you come up with a fairly useful way of cutting up positions in methodology, which is broader than what we were talking about earlier this morning, and I think actually allows us to have these discussions in a much more interesting way. So let's take this idea of mind-world dualism. The mind is separate from the world and is trying to mirror it. If you couple that with this notion that knowledge, you can only know things that we can experience or perceive, then you would be what I would call a neo-positivist. I say neo-positivist rather than positivist, even though most people in the discipline would say positivist, because I like to signal that, in fact, what we call positivist in the discipline isn't actually what Hempel and the Vienna Circle had in mind. So I say neo-positivist, because it's all about falsification. Again, it's dualist to the extent that there's a world you're trying to mirror. It's phenomenalist to the extent that if I can't measure it and I can't touch it, either by myself or with certain specialized instruments, then it doesn't exist and I can't know anything about it. Right? Think about the different kinds of methodological advice that you've gotten over the years for how to make your project more doable. And a lot of it in the discipline seems to amount to this. Make it more concrete, which means give me some sort of an operational indicator for it. Right? So this implicitly animates a lot of this sort of advice that we get. Now, what if you thought that there's a world out there, but your knowledge can go beyond simply what you can perceive, that you can know things about structures, that you can know things about dispositional properties, right? So instead of simply saying, slightly different dichotomy here, or slightly different way of expressing the same thing. If you thought that the only thing you could know about people was their behavior, you would be a neo-positivist because you'd have objective indicators of how people did stuff. If you thought you could know things about people's unobservable mental states or their psychological dispositions, you would be saying, I can go beyond facts. And I can go beyond facts to get at whatever the generative mechanism is that's driving them to do these things. So, but I can't see those directly because I don't have a psychometer. You know, I can't pry open somebody's head and get inside and figure out what's going on. I have to infer what their psychological processes are like. So that would be the kind of research that would fit over there. Within the philosophy of science, this is called realism, critical realism in particular. It is the idea that we can go beyond what we can perceive and have knowledge of the deeper generative structures of reality that give rise to what we can perceive. Right? That sets up a very different set of research agendas, a very different set of research tools in some ways. Now, if we go down to the bottom row and we start talking about monism, so relax the assumption that there's a world and a mind that are separate from each other, and instead say that there's a world that we experience and it is our job to analytically order it. It is our job to put it together in some way that makes logical sense. You would then end up with a position which I would refer to as analyticism. You've seen some of this in Weber. When Weber talks about ideal typifying modes of rational action, he does not mean there's a real world out there where people actually behave like rational actors. What he means is the notion of the rational actor is an analytically useful way to order reality so we can make sense out of it and use it to do things. Interestingly, that Clark and Primo piece that I had you take a look at makes the same argument about rational choice theory. That rational choice theory properly understood, a little caveat that I want to come back to, properly understood is not about hypothesis testing and falsification, because rational choice theorists who actually know what they're talking about realize that the rational actor assumption is not a falsifiable assumption. And if it were, we'd all be in trouble because it's falsified all the time in practice if you treat it as an empirical proposition. But properly understood, it's not an empirical proposition. Properly understood, it is a form of analytical assumption you make so that you can create a model, which can then illuminate various aspects of the world, which would then, two things would then logically follow. One of them is that rational choice theory properly understood should be understood as not precluding other models of the world. It is one model among others, but there can be other models. And the second thing that logically follows is that most rational choice theorists, whether by design or by accident, don't actually say this properly when they are engaged in their own work. Because most rational choice theorists think of rational choice theory as a machine for generating falsifiable hypotheses which can be tested through quantitative regression techniques. This makes no sense. Philosophically, this makes no sense. Pragmatically, politically, in terms of the disciplines, makes all kinds of sense. You use strange numbers and symbols, you use strange numbers and symbols, cool, let's have an alliance. But it's philosophically incoherent. There's Jim Johnson at the University of Rochester is probably the most outspoken critic of what is now called the EITM project, the empirical implications of theoretical models, which is the philosophically absurd idea that a formal model should be used to generate falsifiable hypotheses. And turns out that Clark and Primo, being colleagues and students of his, of course, are actually getting this right and saying, no, that's not what a formal model does. Formal models don't generate hypotheses. Formal models illuminate certain things about reality. They are, in the Weberian sense, ideal types. Don't try to falsify them because they'll always be falsified. That's not their point. That's not what they're supposed to do. Now, I realize by articulating this, this is very different than the way that most rational choice theorists self-present. But that's not my problem. That's their problem. I think that there is a philosophically accurate way to think about rational choice theory, and it would be to put it in this box. And then the final version, if we put together the idea that the world and the mind are continuous with each other, but we can know things that go beyond simple empirical observations of reality, we would end up with a position that I like to call the position about reflexivity, by which I mean that because the mind and the world are continuous with each other, our knowledge has to start with our concrete social location. But we can then go beyond specific things that happen within our own concrete location to talk about the kinds of structural and organizational factors that produce the position that we are in. Now, the main innovation here in terms of what we may be familiar with in political science comes largely from feminist scholarship. A lot of standpoint epistemology starts here. The idea that where we stand, where we are located in a particular set of social hierarchies makes a difference. And because we're located there and we're already internal to it, we can know things about it. because we're in it. But you don't just know about particular empirical facts. You know about the broader whole that puts them together. So, and if you're familiar in sociology with the work of Pierre Bourdieu, that does a lot of work on sort of social fields and such, one of Bourdieu's main arguments is if we want to know things about the social world, we have to start by reflecting on the position of the social analyst. A lot of anthropology does this. A lot of anthropological sort of autoethnography is about this. Start with where I am because I know that because I am that. I'm connected to that. That becomes the basis on which I can then talk about the rest of the world. And I can go beyond it by saying, here are my experiences. Here are the things that give rise to my experiences, so I can know these things. As a feminist scholar, I know patriarchy not as an abstract concept. I know patriarchy because of its effects in my own life and my own position, which is why feminist methodology, unlike other methodologies, engages in active consciousness raising to try to get people to see what those things are like. That procedure would make no sense if you were a neo-positivist, or if your dean were a neo-positivist and you proposed teaching a class on feminist methodology and the dean looked at you like you just drew two heads, because in some ways you did, right? That is, so that, basically that's sort of where we're getting at here with this notion of reflexivity. You can go beyond your experience by reflecting on what's happened within your own experience. You can go beyond it and come to a broader set of knowledges. Why does this matter? Well, let me draw out three kinds of implications of this 2x2. And what I want to do here is I'm going to reuse the 2x2 itself because it's kind of cool and you can just cut and paste the slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's at stake in these different positions. And then after I'm done talking about what's at stake here, we're then going to have a chance to start talking about what these different dichotomies actually mean. The first thing I think that's at stake in terms of this is the status of our knowledge. What does it mean to say we know something? If you are a neo-positivist located up in the phenomenal dualist quadrant, then knowledge is nothing other than an unfalsified conjecture. It's a hypothesis that has survived many rounds of falsification and hasn't yet been falsified. You find this, if you're familiar with the literature on the democratic peace in international relations, which is wholly and completely, with one exception who's actually in the room, neo-positivist, the one exception being Ido Oren over here, who actually wrote a piece which really takes seriously the phenomenal aspects of the democratic peace. But most people who are doing sort of large-end statistical regressions on this stuff, they'll always end their articles by saying things like, this is robust, this is a law, and as yet has survived every test. It's almost this note of anxiety. Maybe it won't one day. Maybe it won't. Gosh, we better keep testing it and make sure. Because if you're a neo-positivist, that's the only certainty you get. If you're a neo-positivist, all you get is the conjecture has survived attempts, earnest attempts to falsify it. And the only way you know you've got good knowledge is if you keep trying to falsify it over and over and over again, and it stands up. And then there's some minor debates that come in there, like how many times you have to do it before you can grant provisional assent to it, and so on and so forth. But philosophically, at the basic core, is this problem that, I mean, David Hume identified a very long time ago, which is, you know the sun's going to come up. And you know the sun's going to come up based on the fact that it did yesterday and the day before and the day before, and there is no number of days that you can observe that will give you 100% confidence that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. So it is this very particular kind of problem of knowledge that is posed, and so the knowledge is only just an unfalsified conjecture. It's never anything else. So knowledge, if you are a realist, is our best approximation. This goes back to this argument about realist philosophers of science will go back to this. They'll sometimes use this as what's called the miracle argument. They'll say things like, there are computers and they work, there are planes and they fly. If science was not the best approximation to how the world is actually set up, the fact that these things happen on a regular basis would be a bloody miracle. Therefore, we can assume that the approximation we have is a pretty good one. That's the realist argument. It's an interesting argument because, of course, it presumes the flying of planes. I'm not sure what the equivalent of that is in political science. But the idea here is that if you are a realist, you hold out hope that you can get knowledge that is the best working approximation to the way the world actually is by figuring out what those undisclosed deep structures are. If you are a monist, your claims for knowledge are a little more modest. You would only say that knowledge is a useful account. Knowledge is a very pragmatic way of cutting up reality and cutting it up for certain kinds of purposes, and knowledge does work. Again, this is back to that American pragmatic tradition. People like William James and John Dewey, very big in the late 19th, early 20th century, trying to reformulate knowledge to take it out of this sphere of like metaphysical transcendence and say, no, to know something means to be able to do something with it. So we know things about politics to the extent that our assumptions about politics and our findings about politics allow us to do things politically. Right? It's a different kind of mode of what counts as knowledge. And then if you are in the reflexivity camp, knowledge and the status of knowledge is not simply that it represents anything or that it captures something, but knowledge instead participates in the social order, and ordinarily for most reflexivist scholars, it is knowledge that is used as some sort of an instrument of either progress or justice or some kind of transformation. So knowledge needs to be directed toward doing things in the world. Now, notice, this would not make any sense to the neo-positivists. Think about how many times people down in that lower right-hand quadrant are accused of politicizing science. But for reflexivists, that's not politicizing science. That's what science is. Because science is based on concrete grounding. So it's not a violation of science to say my knowledge participates in the social order. In fact, if you don't say that, as Habermas once so memorably put it, that we disavow reflection is positivist. So, no, we need to use knowledge to do this. If you don't do that, then you're sort of betraying the whole epistemic project. Right? So, that's the first thing that's at stake. There's a second thing that's at stake. Second thing I think is at stake here is this question of how we warrant knowledge claims, how we know what a good knowledge claim actually is. Yet again, this differs based on where the author is located. So, neo-positivists, you warrant a knowledge claim by attempting to falsify it. Now, often because of the way that the discipline is set up and because of the way we've imported regression analysis, we do this in a way that we're hardly even aware of. We just do it by setting up null hypotheses. It's built into the techniques because we no longer reflect on what we're doing when you set up a null hypothesis and then try to... What you're doing is you're operationalizing a kind of falsification. You're setting up something and you're sort of trying to explore deviations from it, so you're trying to falsify a particular set of conjectures. I mean, that's what goes on when you measure confidence intervals and things like that. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to figure out whether or not this claim works. You're trying to figure out what the contrary evidence, what the likelihood is that you're wrong about these things. So that's how you warrant a knowledge claim, by subjecting it to this kind of critical examination. If you are a realist, you don't do this. If you're a realist, you think the real world is far too complicated to actually conduct empirical tests and generalizations. Instead, you need something slightly more secure for figuring out what the deep structures of reality are actually like, because they don't present themselves directly, so you need to figure out some other way to get it. Realists have two options for this, for getting at what we might think of as these causal powers or capacities. It's the term Brady likes, is capacities. Right? These capacities that objects and entities and institutions have. Realists argue that there's sort of two ways to do this. If you're fortunate enough to be in a laboratory science, you have a lab. Labs are very helpful because a lab allows you to artificially isolate the object and figure out what its capacities are. A road we don't take in political science, but we could, is to think of psychological research in this way. To think of psychological research not as simply administering questionnaires in controlled settings so we can come up with falsifiable hypotheses, but instead studying people's responses under controlled conditions so we can come up with some account of the deep cognitive structures that people have, and then taking those things out on the road, as it were, and seeing what they do in practice. That's not what most psychological researchers do. They generate falsifiable propositions about the reactions that people should have to certain kinds of stimuli. Right? But instead, if they went a realist route, they could do something a little bit different. The other way you can do this, if you don't have a laboratory, is to engage in a kind of abductive reasoning. So here is the capitalist system. It stays together. What must be the case for the capitalist system to stay together? Oh, right, okay. All of this stuff that Marx had to say. So then you can sort of come up with this by reasoning backwards from the empirics and saying, here's what I've got my hands on. So here are the set of undetectable capacities of advanced capitalist economies. You find actually, to the extent that realism has made an inroad into political science, you find it in some of the studies of the European welfare states and some of the studies now of the dismantling of welfare states. What are the unrealized latent capacities of certain kinds of coalitions? And if they come together and activate what their powers are, how do those things combine in a coalitional sense to tear apart these social bargains? So you do get sort of work that draws on these things, again, based on this idea of undetectable powers that underlie objects, which you can't see, can't measure them. If you are a monist, if you are a phenomenal monist, then you don't think that warrants knowledge, because you don't think you can go beyond experience. And you certainly don't think that you have knowledge that is warranted because you've attempted to falsify it. Instead, you think you have knowledge that is warranted if it is a good formalized expression of a set of cultural values. This is, again, where Weber is very, very helpful on this stuff. Weber points out that objectivity, we did not assign Weber's objectivity essay, though if we had more time, I would have assigned Weber's objectivity essay. Weber is very, very clear that what he means by objective is not there's a world out there that I'm mirroring. What he means is I articulate as clearly as possible what my own value commitments are and the limits of what they show me about the world, and then I stick to them logically and rigorously. That's what objectivity means for Weber. It's weird how often that essay gets completely cited ass backwards, as if what Weber was saying was that political science should be about producing value-neutral inquiry that transcends all possible positions. That's the total opposite of what Weber said. Weber said there's no such thing as a neutral science. There's no such thing as a cultural science or a science of society that doesn't have a position built into it. And because it has a position, how do you know you have good knowledge? Because you've got a nice formalized expression of what that is, and that becomes your analytical model. This is an area where I think Weber gets this a little better than most of the rational choice folks do. Most of the rational choice folks, actually Andrew Abbott nicely pointed this out in a piece he wrote once on rational choice theory, in which he said rational choice theorists don't have to spell out many of their assumptions about human social action when they're talking to Americans. And the reason they don't have to spell those assumptions out is because those are the assumptions that Americans imbibe with their breakfast cereal. Right? Rational choice theory makes very Lockean assumptions about human individuals making rational calculations to put arrangements together and so on. We sort of treat that as obvious. But if you think about it, rational choice theory is in many ways just a formalization of certain American cultural values, especially late industrial American cultural values in the 20th century. And if you look at the pattern of where rational choice theory is utilized around the world, you find some very interesting things about who uses it, who gloms onto it and thinks it's intuitively obvious and who doesn't. Rational choice theorists in the United States don't tend to have to spell this out. But if they did, then that's what they would spell out. And wouldn't it be interesting if we thought of rational choice theory as a cultural expression rather than as the kind of grandiose things it's often claimed to be? And then the final quadrant here is the warrant for knowledge if you are a reflexivist is that kind of awareness of one's own embeddedness. Which is why, if you try to locate yourself at that quadrant and someone, your editor, your dissertation advisor, somebody says, get rid of all of this throat-clearing autobiographical nonsense that shows up in some part, or put it in an appendix. No. This is central to the methodology. This is absolutely central to the methodology. Because if the warrant for knowledge claims, if you are a reflexivist, the warrant for going beyond experience is a systematic reflection on your own experiences, you have to have a systematic reflection on your own experiences. It's got to be there. It's got to be part of it. If you don't have that, what you're saying then either turns into an ideal type, or perhaps it turns into some kind of a conjecture about the deep properties of the world. So it collapses. The only way to keep reflexivity together as a methodology is to say this self-reflection is essential to my knowledge-producing practice. It's not extraneous. It's what I do. It's central. Right? And let's do the last one. The other things that are at stake here. I think there's also some question about research design that is at stake. And I think if we run around the table here fairly quickly, then of course neo-positivists, once again, are testing hypotheses in increasingly general settings. Parenthetically, every single article that's been written in political science over the last 15 or 20 years about comparison is in that box. Because everybody who's talking about case comparison is basically already assuming that the whole goal here is to come up with empirical generalizations. So all of this stuff about how do you select cases to get certain kinds of negative values of this, that, and the other thing. And there was this piece that I think it was Gertz and Mahoney had a piece in APSR a couple years ago about they had a really neat visual illustration of a cube. And they said there's things on the back of the cube that you have to select cases in those typologies too. That's all really neat at the level of method if you're already a neo-positivist. Right? But neo-positivists presume that's the goal of knowledge, increasingly general hypothesis test. If you're a realist, that's not it. Your job is to create an accurate picture of the world, not an increasingly general hypothesis test. Your job is to come up with a finer and finer specification of what the causal powers of entities and institutions are. So what exactly are the unrealized possibilities of transformation in advanced industrial democracies? What coalitions aren't being utilized here? What kinds of transformative practices can we actually see and forward and push in particular ways? Right? That's a very different epistemic goal, leads to very different kinds of research design. The only reason if you were a critical realist you would compare is to try to get a better sense of what the different causal powers are. And Robert's going to talk more about causal powers and mechanisms tomorrow, but it sort of sets that up. If you're an analyticist, then you would, instead of doing either of those two things, right, what do? You construct what are called analytical narratives, and I don't mean what the Levy et al. Book calls analytic narratives, if you're familiar with that. Because the Levy et al. Book basically says that an analytic narrative is a hypothesis test of a rational model, which is doubly philosophically incoherent. Because it's not an analytical narrative, and models aren't supposed to be tested. An analytical narrative is more what Charles Tilly talks about in that piece that we assigned to you. Right? An analytical narrative is an account, a case-specific account, of how certain kinds of ideal typical factors that you've isolated and put together in your ideal typical model come together to generate a specific outcome. That's what you end up with. That is what an analytical narrative looks like. It's a specific account of what happens in a particular case. Does that mean that analyticism is necessarily single case? Well, you can do multiple cases by talking about different ways in which things concatenate and configure, but you can't take number of cases and somehow infer a general finding from it. Right? That doesn't work that way. And the main reason it doesn't work that way is because all the claims that you use when you're designing an analytical model are already phrased in an analytically general form. They're already logical. They're already universal in that sense. Right? Rational choice is a good example of this. When rational choice theorists talk about bargaining equilibria and bargaining models, they don't use proper names. They have these general processes. That's not an empirical generalization. That's a logical claim that is general by form. It's not like they've gone out and observed a bunch of stuff and said, oh, this is how bargaining works. Instead, they've said, here's an analytical model that we can then apply to this situation that will give us some insight into what's going on here. That's a totally different operation than hypothesis testing. It's a totally different operation than saying I observed a bunch of stuff and generalized up. Right? So it's deductive. Right? It works downwards. And so this is in many ways what I think people would do if you have more of an analytical research design. What is it that makes a particular case unique? What happens in a particular situation? Weber has some of the best examples of this in some of his accounts of capitalism and sort of how capitalism is produced. There's also some good stuff, as I said, in Tilly. If you're familiar with Tilly, Tarrow, and McAdams' work on dynamics of contention and social movements, there's certainly some work there where, again, what generalizes, quote unquote, are mechanisms and processes, not variables, and they don't come up and create nomothetic generalizations that go across cases. They do very different kinds of things. And finally, if we are down in the reflexivity box, what's our goal? Our goal is to theorize the actually existing social conditions that we ourselves are embedded in. Right? So this sets up, again, very different kinds of things. If you compared cases when you were doing that kind of work, comparisons would be, in a sense, to dislocate. You compare with what people do in other situations so that you can call greater attention to what's going on in your own. That's a kind of dislocating or mind-expanding comparison. Geertz has a really, really strong claim for this in this book called Local Knowledge, where he points out that in many ways why you do anthropological comparison is simply to call into question the taken-for-grantedness of your own cultural assumptions. So that's what it does. It highlights them. It brings these things out. So by way of saying that, all four of these you could compare, but it would mean very different things. In all four of these, you could talk to people, but it would mean very different things. In all four of these, you could count, but it would mean very different things. Right? Method goes across all of these things. These, I think, are the issues that we're actually concerned about. And if we're going to talk about what the difference that interpretation makes and interpretivism makes, that's the level at which we have to locate it. Now, having said what's at stake, I want to very briefly conclude by saying what's not at stake in these distinctions. There are some things that are not covered here specifically, and one of them, of course, is the question of method or technique. Nothing in what I've just outlined is going to help you decide whether or not to use numbers. Nothing I've said in so far is going to help you decide whether or not you need to talk to people. That comes from the specifics of the kind of cases you're working on and the kind of empirical material you're working with. What you do with it, how you design it, what its status is, that's what methodology speaks to. Debates about specific objects are not covered here. There is no way in which you could say, because I am a monist, I will only study the following sets of things. Or because I am a dualist. You know, I get very annoyed at the sort of the sloppy way we sometimes do this in the field, where we'll say things like, oh, that's just not a quantifiable factor. Yeah, it is. You're just not being clever enough. It could be. Now, there may be good reasons not to quantify it. That's fine. Give me reasons why we shouldn't quantify it, but please don't tell me something can't be quantified. It could be, if you really wanted it to be. Now, you may have very, very good philosophically defensible reasons why that's not the right way to go about it. Yeah, rest your claim there. Don't rest your claim with some kind of position about the empirics. The main reason for doing this, of course, is that if you do rest your account on something empirical, it's very easy for somebody to say, oh, and you only know that because it makes some sort of a difference in the behavior of the object in question, which we could then quantify and measure. All of a sudden, there's no more methodological diversity, right? So instead of grounding our claims in some putative character of the object, you ground your methodological claims in these sets of philosophical positions and say, here's how you cash it out. This doesn't affect the scientific status of anything. I would argue, and I argue at great length in my book, that all four of these are science. These are all scientific. They are different kinds of science, but they are all four scientific. And so don't let anybody tell you you're not being scientific if you're engaged in a feminist critique. You are. It's just not neo-positivist science. It's something else. And it has its own rich history and its own set of philosophical groundings. And again, I think this does not change the primary focus of what we do on explaining and understanding politics. This vocabulary that I've tried to introduce is a vocabulary for clarifying what we do and how we do it. It is not a suggestion that we should all simply become methodologists or philosophers of political science. That would be disastrous. Instead of doing that, what I think we need to do is we need to have a little more cognizance of this so that we can, in a sense, become, in that way, better political scientists. More philosophically aware of the kinds of assumptions that we're making and of the diversity of options that we could choose. So if the net result here is that people would no longer be able to, or they have good answers to the question, oh, you shouldn't be able to do that, that's not science. Well, yes, it is. And let me explain to you why, and why it makes a difference, and why I do it this way as opposed to doing it another way. So this is not a recipe for field-wide consensus, but it is, I think, a recipe for some better debates. So, we are running a little late. What time do you want to have lunch?
12:15 would be fine.
Well, what we heard was that there would be some slippage.
Yep.
And maybe better word than leakage. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't like the idea that I'm going to leak. Yeah, I don't really like the idea that yeah, slippage is better.
No, that was my doing whatever it was. So, in our own minds, I think we were figuring
Right.
that as long as we presented ourselves
Okay.
upstairs by 12.
Because what I'd like to do, because what we plan to do next is, let's see, of all the pieces that we assigned you, or all the pieces that we put out for reading, the one that probably most directly looked to people like interpretive political science was the Carol Cohn piece. But what's interesting in terms of the vocabulary that I've just introduced is that Cohn's piece entirely operates at the level of method. She doesn't talk about research design. She doesn't talk about the status of knowledge. She talks about technique. And does a very, very good and careful job talking about technique. So what we had thought we would do is that we would divide ourselves back up into those four groups and spend a few minutes in different rooms so that we didn't all overwhelm each other, talking a little bit about where we think Carol Cohn fits and how her project would be different if it were located in some of the other boxes. Do you think that we can do that in about 20 minutes and then come back and have a brief wrap-up and then go to lunch? So where do you want you have four rooms?
Is it possible to have a general?
You want to, the other thing we could do is just have general and then sort of go on from there. People want to do that instead? We could do general. That's fine. That's fine. Yep. No, I'm happy to. Let me just get this thing saved here. Tim, did you have a specific you want to start with, or?
You go with the last two.
I'll stick the slide up in just a second. I'm getting the podcast to save here, so this will take me just a moment. So get your questions in order. And of course, when you're trying to hurry, you always make typos. La 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 la. All right. And now we'll just save it where it belongs, which is in here. All right, so which slide did you want up? The 2x2. Do you want the one with implications, or you want the one that has the four names for the 4 approaches? Oh, you want the what's at stake?
Yeah.
Or what's not at stake?
What's at stake? Right.
Number 3, what's at stake?
Research.
All right, so the research design slide. Zoom, 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 zoom. Okay, research design slide. Tim.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think it was really, really helpful for opening up the discussion. I have 3 quick questions on it. The first is, I know you don't like the term interpretivist, but since this is a non-interpretivist, I'm wondering if you would agree that interpretivists generally occupy the bottom half of the in other words, interpretivists might be described as an umbrella of both phenomenalists and transfactualists,
Right.
who are nonetheless monists.
So a question about interpretivism, is interpretivism in a sense covering the bottom row? I think sociologically, you're right. I think sociologically, most people in the field now who would self-identify as interpretivist or be interested in doing interpretive work would self-identify down there with some notion that the mind is not separate from the world, and our job is not to have some sort of accurate depiction of a mind-independent reality that's out there someplace. Part of the reason for not using interpretivist, though, leave it as an open question whether you could have interpretivism in the other categories. Now, I think you're right sociologically that tends to be where most people locate themselves. But that said, it's amazing, again, because of the vocabulary that we've sort of saddled with, that even those of us that are interested in that will then still fall back on vocabulary about variables and about hypotheses. And it's like, oh, okay, so wait, there's something odd going on here. And I don't know whether interpretivism is enough of a coherent category to provide an answer to that.
Okay.
So,
I think it'd be an interesting thought experiment to think about what a dualist interpretivist would look like. But,
So do I.
But can we bracket that? My second quick question is about your separation between methods and methodology.
yes. Yeah.
I think it's helpful, but I think that even in your talk there was some leakage.
Of course.
Right?
I'm leaking all over
popular
this.
word.
Yep.
But for example, I think it's possible to think of some methods as being more genetically coded with methodological assumptions than others. So you talked about participant observation,
Right.
or ethnography as being more amenable to a monist position. And this is why David Layton wants to harness and discipline ethnography within a positivist paradigm, or why it's so difficult to think of a monist regression analysis, right? Because some methods or some techniques do contain sort of genetic coding that force you into certain methodological implications.
Well, responding as someone who's not a realist, and therefore somebody who's not particularly happy with the genetic metaphor, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an open question whether or not things like regression are genetically encoded to be dualist, or whether ethnography is genetically encoded to be monist. And I think it's an interesting open question, one I'd love to actually see both discussion and actual research on. Whether or not those linkages between method and methodology are ideal typical dichotomy, either purely sociological, the result of the way people have been educated in the discipline, or whether they have actual philosophical content to them. And I'm not sure. I think it's an open question. And I think you're absolutely right to say that, as with the first thing, a lot of what I'm trying to do is provoke a set of thought experiments that we haven't had, because we haven't had that discussion. And part of the reason we haven't had that discussion is because people are not thinking of it in these sorts of terms that opens this up. So we don't run the thought experiment about what a dualist ethnography would be. That would be really interesting to see. Now, maybe it's a category that turns out not to be logically coherent. But I think it would be useful for us to actually have that discussion and see whether or not we could actually do that. And I think in many ways you can read Layton as trying. I mean, that's sort of what Layton is, and of course when most people look at Layton stuff and they say that's not ethnography. But that's an interesting debate now about what ethnography is and whether it's a method or a methodology, right? So I think this helps to clarify what that project is. But yes, I mean, as I said at the beginning, the whole point of this vocabulary is to set up a different set of combinations and a different set of discussions that we aren't presently having.
And then just my third comment / question is more general, which is that you've taken us to the store of ontology today,
Yep.
and asked us to trade in one set of 2x2s for another.
Yep.
And
I gotta give you a
so,
take-home message, right?
as someone I think who occupies the bottom right-hand corner of your box, not that I like putting myself into boxes, I want to be reflexive about this and start with our positionality within the discipline and ask, in a very pragmatic way, what does substituting this set of terms get us? And isn't there a planned sort of obsolescence in every set of new terms that gets rolled out? In the sense that they're shiny and new and sharp in the lecture hall, but then in the practices of research themselves, which is where terms actually do work, they become messy and muddy. For example, we could think of understanding and explanation in this way. They might have once been rolled out as a sharp axe, which has now become dull.
Right.
So what work can we expect or ask these terms to do for us? Particularly, I think, as maybe Dorian will follow up on this. Some of especially with the columns, there seems to be, some confusion that's not dissimilar from explanation and understanding, for example.
Well, I think you make two very good points there. I mean, one of them is obviously, if we're trying to, this is one of the things that one can learn from studying the sociology of disciplines. Any new innovation necessarily builds on and transforms what went before it. So there are ways in which some of this echoes some of the things that were in the terms we were talking about this morning, and changes them and supervenes on them and sort of twists them around in different ways. So this is not wholly new. I mean, there's ways in which this is somewhat familiar, but it sort of pushes it in different directions, which is sort of what I'm going for. In terms of payoffs and planned obsolescence, which is a great term, I like that.
It means you could write another book in 5 years.
Well, of course. No, I mean, I think that I would amend it slightly. I would say it's not planned obsolescence. I would say it's unplanned obsolescence. Terms do have to be renewed. Right? This is sort of how the human sciences work. We go back to our founding text and we bring things back again. It's like, oh, cool, Durkheim said this. Now let's freshen it up and sort of say this again. And it works differently in this different kind of context. So I think that there's always that kind of movement. I would be very reluctant to put sunset legislation on this. Let's use this for 5 years and then let's ditch it. I think you're right. I think over time that's the kind of thing that happens as these distinctions sort of get blurry in actual practice, which is something that I fully expect. But in terms of what I would like pragmatically the assumption here, frankly, I'm just sick and tired of having folks whose understanding of the philosophy of science goes no further than third-hand lacatoge, who take our work, my work, and say, you're just putting in facts to prove a point. No, that's not what we're doing. There is a content to this. There is a philosophical underpinning to this, and there's a legitimacy to this. This is a real thing. This is an actual contribution to knowledge. So stop trying to rule me out a priori. In the short term, that is what I would love to see. In order to make these things work, since I think we're not supposed to be philosophers of science, I think that what we need work. We need empirical work. We need empirical work that actually demonstrates the utility of especially these three boxes, which are, we got enough of this, we got a lot of that. But we need things that demonstrate the utility of these kinds of assumptions. And then, 5, 10, 15 years from now, then maybe we can have a discussion about, okay, have we outgrown the typology? Have we gone beyond that? In the short term, I hope it opens up some space to be able to do some different kinds of work.
Just to follow up on Tim's last question, I have a feeling, and maybe I'm thinking wrong, that your sort of presentation of the dominant discourse in our discipline is a bit of a caricature. So the first, the bad 2x2, the bad taxonomic exercise, I've never seen it in any textbook or in any, and I could maybe be completely wrong. For example, the qual disputation usually belongs to the first cell, not the bad taxonomy. So no one would set it up like that. Most people, in fact, have ontology and epistemology on the x-axis, and then keep explanation and understanding why. And that's usually how these things are taught and how I might teach it. But this is, so I'm wondering, what would be the value added of this as opposed to something that you had?
All right, let me give you two answers. What would be the value of this over the kind of ontology, epistemology sort of thing we get? One answer is that, I don't want to go into the extreme derivation, because we're happy to chat about it afterward. One of the problems is that the terms ontology and epistemology, as we use them in political science, come in with a bias attached to them, and they come in with a dualistic bias and a realist bias attached to them. So they come in a way that it kind of foreshadows this claim that we should put ontology before epistemology. That's programmed into the way those terms have been brought into the discipline because of the people who brought them into the discipline, which had a particular kind of agenda attached to them. So they use these terms in this way. So in that sense, I think that this vocabulary allows us to, doesn't say that's wrong, that ontology should come first, but it allows us to at least ask the question rather than prejudging the answer in the vocabulary itself. Is there an answer prejudged in this vocabulary? Of course there is. There's always answers prejudged in this vocabulary. But I think the answer that's prejudged in this vocabulary is an answer about methodological pluralism. And it's an answer about not just method pluralism, and it's an answer not just about empirical pluralism, but it's an answer about a pluralism in the ways we construct knowledge. Yes, that's a very clear sort of interventionist commitment on my part, and that's what this is designed to do. I would bet, and I would argue incessantly, that this is a recipe for more pluralism in the discipline than the existing typologies, because the existing typologies foreclose options. So,
I wonder, it could be a recipe for more pluralism, but I can also imagine it being a recipe for segmentation and fragmentation, because the neo-positivists can't talk to anybody else. They're talking in a particular language. And you could say this, the realists talk to the realists, and nobody in the four boxes talks to each other. And ultimately, we're all interested in explaining politics, which would be a terrible shame if we can no longer even talk to one another. So whatever the ills of having a neo-positivist dominated discipline, in a certain way, it allows us all to talk to one another in a particular way, even if we don't like the position in the terms in which we talk to each other. It does allow us to talk to one another. And I wonder, I guess, for students who are writing their dissertation, they really, if they're planting their flag and saying, I'm going to do reflexive work and fuck you, and, if you don't understand it, this is a legitimate methodology. That could be a really dangerous position to stake out.
No.
Why?
Why? Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Because you alienate, or you can not even necessarily alienate, but you're talking a language that people in the other boxes just don't understand. You're no longer sharing a common language.
Yeah, or you
So
don't
say that's
anticipate
too fair.
objections from an audience that isn't, barricaded in your box.
I think that you don't have to say it with the "fuck you," because I'm very serious about that. And there are many times and places where I would advocate saying it with that. But what I wanted to say is I think that.
By the way, I don't advocate you actually use those words.
not with your advisors.
Yeah.
No, but I think what you say about science and the fact that there are many ways to call what we all do science, and that's absolutely critical at this point in methodological time in political science, and that people need to understand the philosophy of science issues at stake. I would absolutely agree with. So that, for example, when I can pull out Weber, it silences so many people who otherwise, cannot. Who do we appeal to? We can, Weber is Augustine for theologians. Everybody, appeals to Augustine in Christian theology. But anyway, that's a different. But my beef, where I would agree here, is that I would hope that you would put this forth not as a replacement, but with a very strong sense of irony, because and make that absolutely clear, because it seems to me that the quote-unquote empirical or substantive work that is in fact being done by many people in this room already does upset this, and that it's already perhaps obsolete. I mean, any one of these, I have a congenital objection, and I think it's congenital and not simply socialized, but it could be the latter, to 2x2 tables. But unless they're done with a fair bit of irony.
Sure.
And so,
No,
so for example, in IR, that last bit, the way you described it comes very much out of reflexivity of the self.
Right.
But what about all of the IR, the critical reflexivity on various meta-narratives of power, right? And that kind of slides already between many of these,
Sure.
So I guess
Oh, yeah.
I would just put forth, I wouldn't even put lines between those things. I'd, make them squiggles or something. So that's my plea.
Well, and certainly, I mean, in terms of the I'll say two things about the sharpness of the, or lack of sharpness of the lines. First of all, remember, this is an ideal type, and there is something that, I mean, again, this is just sort of congenital to me in terms of how I tend to think about
Okay.
it. It is better, I think, to start with an abstract, too pure depiction, which is then going to be messed up in practice, precisely because the deviations from the ideal are what's interesting. So this is simply a grid, and then you sort of lay it down and go, oh, interesting. You're sort of blurring the line. That's neat, right? Think about Weber's notions of authority, right? To actually see something that just looks like an ideal type of rational legal authority is boring. What's interesting is when it's rational legal and a little bit of charismatic. Ooh, look at that. They're combining things. It's deviating from the ideal in interesting ways. That's what makes it empirically interesting. So I think these are ways of helping us clarify some of our thinking about this so that then we can orient ourselves toward these things and then say, I am going to sort of blur the boundary here. So I set this out. I wouldn't say I set it out with a sense of irony. I'd say I set it out with a sense of ideal typification, that it is supposed to be less than the reality. But it is supposed to just kind of direct us into sort of thinking about some of these issues to, again, hopefully open up some more space to actually be engaged in these sorts of very interesting empirical work that we probably should be doing.
Yeah. Just a couple things. I also really enjoyed the talk, and there was a lot of fruit for thinking here. But just off of what you just said, and then back to the tables again.
Sure.
One of the dangers, though, in thinking of the problem only being between blurring the boundaries or having set boundaries is that one doesn't then necessarily interrogate the concepts that are operating in those boundaries. So you invoked Weber, and there's what's so neat about Weber, you said, was the ability to see regimes in action that, or authority rather, that operates with charismatic and rational legal authority, for example. But what that doesn't do is interrogate what he means by charismatic authority, for example. So one also has to be careful that that's not the only kind of unsettling that we do.
It's a good point.
Another little point about sort of on this table here, the reflexivity theory, so starting with our own, I would just add to that, and including an interrogation of what our own means as well.
If the box were bigger, then yeah, I mean, certainly interrogate. It's a very good emendation. The starting with our own is certainly not to reify what our own is,
right?
But to look at the ways in which our ownness is actually reproduced by the kind of positionalities that we occupy, the strategies of boundary demarcation that we're engaged in. Okay. Again, calling all that stuff to mind is but and just on your the thing about calling categories into question. Again, this is not, to use a distinction I was offering before about science. This isn't science. This is an organization of certain kinds of scientific practices. It is not itself a scientific claim. It is not itself a claim that is designed to generate knowledge. It is a claim that is designed to open thinking space. It is a claim that is designed as a certain kind of vocabulary-based disciplinary intervention that legitimates certain kinds of things and makes possible different sorts of work. That said, if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, I mean, at the end of the day, you probably guess, I live here. And end of the day, if this doesn't do what it's supposed to do in the discipline, then you ditch it and you theorize another one. This is simply a pragmatic suggestion about a way of organizing various kinds of things. And before I go to that, I wanted to get back to your question about the sort of archipelago nature of something. If anyone actually mistook the ideal typicality of these things for real positions, then I think we would have that problem. Because then people would say, oh, here's the orthodoxy of box 2, and I need to be in the orthodoxy of box 2. Almost no one actually lives in the orthodoxy of box 2 or box 3 or anything else. And they even have different sort of categories for use of sorting these things. But the point being that I think what this does, by the reason why I want to draw the boundary lines in, is because the discipline we have now operates with the idea that in order to have good social science, you need a consensus about these matters. I think we need a consensus about what to disagree about.
Can I just ask my two questions? What's at stake, number 2? Can you go to that one
Sure.
for a moment? This is just operating within your categories and your boundaries at the moment. I don't actually understand why reflexivity, awareness of one's own, I'm sorry, I'm short-sighted to stand here, awareness of one's own embeddedness isn't over in the phenomenal. Why is that in the transfactual part? That should be monism. That should be another one under monism and phenomenal, right?
I don't think so.
Okay, so just
because I
tell me
don't
why.
think
I didn't understand that.
none of the feminist scholars and critical Frankfurt School folks that I have read would be content with the idea that structures of domination are simply empirical, that they transcend and give rise to empirical phenomena. Patriarchy is not simply an empirical fact. It is a generative structure that gives rise to observed empirical facts.
Okay, so that gets us to the whole transfactual issue.
Yes. But the thing is that they, at the same time, want to maintain that monistic connection between the mind and the world. That's the thing that people... Bourdieu is also very good at this, right? Because Bourdieu doesn't want to say there are these real structures that are out there in the world that are mind-independent, operate in a mind-independent way. But he doesn't want to say that knowledge is limited to experience either. It's tempting to flesh out what that category looks like.
Yeah, I think my second question, I didn't realize how much it related to this, but it was about sort of your notion of what the transfactual is and its relationship to structuralism, because you can have an understanding of structuralism that says yes, as you suggested, that what I'm seeing is not patriarchy, but instances of patriarchy.
Right.
But you could also have a notion of, I don't know what you would think about it, a kind of more performative notion where what you see is in fact what it is. So these aren't embellishments of a domination independently existing. They are the thing itself.
And that's the debate about Butler. If you want to go, we want to go into sort of into feminist performativity. The debate about Butler is where do we think about where Butler fits and where do we orient our own work. Again, back to my main suggestion, I think having these as categories helps us have that discussion and understand why it's important to have that discussion about Butler, as opposed to what happens if you just try to slot Butler into a neo-positivist frame, in which it makes no sense. And you say, well, wait, then you could have a falsifiable hypothesis about what a performance would do? I mean, that would just totally not be what Butler would do. I agree with you. I think that's a great illustration of my point, that what's interesting here is precisely those ambiguous, what do we do with this? Where does this fit? Not that I'm saying we need to necessarily all agree on where it fits, but having the discussion allows us to flesh out what those assumptions are like and what implications they have. Butler's a great example.
Patrick, I'm wondering if part of this discussion is explained by the way that you treat another concept, and that is experience. In order to ask that question, I need to go back to the end of the session before we took the coffee break. And that is to ask you where are hermeneutics and phenomenology in your three-part statement. Are you subsuming them there under critical theory or not? For me, they're not in the realism, nor are they in the third one, so I missed them. And then bringing phenomenology into the picture enables us to ask a different question about experience, or to get to a different definition, perhaps, of experience, because I'm experiencing some slippage in your treatment of experience between sense-based experience and the kind of way that phenomenologists and others talk about embodied experience. That's not just sense-based stuff. So I'm looking for
that's why
more here.
That's why the word is phenomenal, not just experience. There is a long discussion that we could have, but I would just sort of jump to the end of it. I would suggest that when I'm choosing the term phenomenal precisely because I want to pick that up. It's not sense experience. It is more the phenomenalist understanding of what experience means, and the directness and the intentionality of experience. So experience is not simply sense perception, but has other things kind of embedded and encoded. That, I think, and it's weird because that's not usually how neo-positivists think of themselves. But if you think about what neo-positivists actually do, they actually do have a certain kind of intentionality built into their notions of experience. They're just not very aware of it. They're not very conscious of it. They're not pushing it out there very far. But this idea that reality exists as a set of inert quantifiable quantities is itself a particular kind of, in sort of phenomenological language, a particular kind of intention. It's a certain kind of intentional grasp of the world. It's one kind among others. So I don't want to differentiate between or get into the specific nuances of phenomenology here. I just want to say the notion of experience that I have is certainly broader than just sense experience. And that's why I do that. Well, your first question.
Where do you put phenomenology and hermeneutics into your schema?
Oh, hermeneutics is a good one because hermeneutics, I think, is like interpretive. I'm not sure. And I think that there are people who plausibly say that they are doing hermeneutics who fit in a number of different boxes. I think it's a really interesting discussion to have. Old school hermeneutics in the sort of old German historicist tradition very clearly articulates itself as a form of monism and largely as a form of analytical monism. But then it gets blurry. Right, so that they're trying to analyze how the specific tradition of hermeneutics. I mean, where does Gadamer fit exactly? And that's kind of hard to tell. So when Gadamer says horizon, is a Gadamerian horizon a reflexive awareness, or as the Frankfurt School would say, are Heidegger and Gadamer basically just being completely ignorant of their own social conditions? So again, live debate about these things. Once again, we can have that discussion if we sort of approach it in these terms. There was a hand back.
Would you go to slide 1, to
Sure.
what is thing number 1?
We're just sort of walking backwards here.
I just want to make sure we cover everything.
Sure. Completeness. I like completeness.
Okay, so I have a strong disagreement with reflexivity as reflecting an instrument of progress or justice, because I think, one, that's not reflective of all reflexive projects, but secondly, it could fit actually in all 4 of those boxes. So I would actually, you said
Sorry, in which camp? Justice or reflexivity?
instrument of
Instrumentalism.
progress and justice.
Right.
And I think a better categorization is what you actually said when you were describing that. You said it's knowledge participates in the social order.
That's right.
I think that's
That's
more.
what
I think that fits better than what's reflected.
I'll claim. I'm typing this on a plane.
Because even neo-positivists believe, right, that their research,
totally.
right?
No,
Okay.
you're absolutely right. That's a great modification. No, it's not the case that reflexive knowledge would necessarily have to be.
Right.
I think what I'm trying to signal there is that reflexivists are often much more comfortable with that language
Right.
than a lot of other people are.
Right.
But I think
Often
you're
they're
right. As a
extremely
defining
uncomfortable.
constitutive
The whole
character of the
Arendtian
category, I
thing, if you
don't
think
think
of them
that
as
is the defining characteristic of the category. You're absolutely right. Good.
Have to.
I also enjoyed the talk. I think I'm picking up on what's been said, and to a certain extent, just to push to clarify a bit more, especially when you're talking about regressive structures. Because when you were talking about structures, I think briefly mentioning Foucault, it seemed like you were suggesting that structures are almost deep or beneath the surface.
I think for most structuralists it is, and this is the whole debate about Foucault, whether Foucault's a structuralist or not.
Well, he seemed to be identifying very clearly with structural patterns on the surface.
Right.
So
Which is why a number of structuralists say he's not a structuralist.
Well,
Is that
what
whole
I'm saying is
thing?
that structuralism shouldn't, or structure should not be confined to beneath the surface. I think we should look at structures. It's very important to look at structures on the surface as well. I mean, Marx's big point is that, it's not that nobody can see structures of capitalist domination. It's that they persist despite the fact that they're there for everyone to see, right? And that's the question. So if we look at structures on the surface level, then it really forces us to ask different questions.
Right, and in fact, what this does, I mean, your reference to Marx is a good one, because if you go back into sort of Marxist structural theory, this is this interesting debate within Marxism about precisely what a structure is. So eventually, this shows up as the sort of Poulantzas versus Miliband debate about what a structure, what it means to the bourgeoisie to dominate the state and things like this. So this is certainly a live debate going on within Marxism. The only reason I used structure to talk about this, again, looking for a shorthand way to sort of quickly express in the course of a short talk what the difference is between an empiricist and a transfactual kind of view, or what a phenomenalist and transfactual view is. Most people's understanding of structure, I think, is deep structure, and so that's kind of why I was utilizing that. But no, you're certainly right in terms of the actual debates. I mean, you want to talk further than Marx. You want to talk about Nicholas and Luhmann, right? So Luhmannian notions of structure. Where does that go? There are various different ways of understanding how structure would work. But I think for most people, the idea is that structure is not empirical. Structure is behind empirics, and it gives rise to empirics. That's certainly the thread that the realists pick up on. So
That's fair. Just one quick second. That's for you. on reflexivity, and I think I'm saying something that Lisa was, or trying to build up something Lisa was saying with the rest of the our own. Does reflexivity have to depend on autobiographical details being presented, or just like sort of a description of where I am in this? Sorry.
You're on that, and then you.
Okay.
I just have a question.
I have to. Oh, sorry.
Well, do you want? Well, it's because it's related to.
Okay, well, I'll just finish briefly.
Okay, go ahead.
So does it have to? I mean, for me, it seems like reflexivity doesn't have to be about like personal, sort of experience, feel of a person. It seems like reflexivity is about identifying the conditions, the analysis that we're performing, the conditions of possibility for that. How am I able to make this analysis? You know, or is there a contradiction in society that I've seen that forces me to intervene? And that sense of reflexivity, about being conscious of what it is that's motivating me to intervene and allowing me to do so, I think is more robust than a autobiographical sort of awareness of one's embeddedness or the gesturing.
But I guess the response to that would be: is the autoethnographic awareness of how one's own biography plays into this therefore not a form of reflexivity, or does reflexivity in fact cover both of those kinds of things?
It could be, but one would have to demonstrate why that autobiographical sort of presentation of facts is able to contribute to an analysis of broader.
And there's certainly, I mean, again, this goes to the Frankfurt School traditions of this. There's all kinds of ways in which people try to integrate these things, and there's a whole debate in anthropology about autoethnography, about exactly what the limitations of these things are. So yeah, I think again, you're putting your finger on a live debate, which is something that maybe I needed to change the term I use so as to signal awareness of that debate, but certainly I wouldn't want to preclude that. So
I'd like to make an intervention here, just to check. Are we all right with going for another 5 minutes? Yeah. I'm going to suggest clustering a few questions, and I saw that here there were a few on the point of reflexivity.
Yeah, so I know that Ito and Joe want to get in on reflexivity. So let me put and then I'll turn back to my left so as not to be politically biased and make sure that's so Joe and then Ito.
I agree. I really did like the talk, and I think that your response that a lot of these questions in terms of this allows you to have this kind of debate, I think is actually a really good response that unfalsifiable. Okay. My thought is, and it does get to the reflexivity thing, is maybe your grasp would help have a sort of what are the biggest problems each of these boxes run into? Because the whole time I was thinking, feminist standpoint theory is like now 30 years old, and like many academic feminists have real serious problems with it.
Sure.
Among them, the kind of autobiographical narcissism thing, and recursive sort of this internal atomism issue, and heterostatizing. I think things that people aren't hearing, right? So to not have it on the graph, and just have the reflexivity as this instrument of justice, is a problem. It's sort of the silver bullet that doesn't exist.
Sure.
So I wonder, if you would have a sort of problems that these boxes face, because also that might help me think, okay, well, if this is the kind of problem I run into, then I might pick from this other box to address that problem that I'm running into.
Right. I'll come back to this second.
Awesome presentation. Quick note on reflexivity. First of all, the meaning of it in Greek or in Latin is basically turning back upon oneself, and transferred to science, it's science turning its own tools, its own gaze back upon itself. And then the question is, one way to think about it is the individual scholar reflecting about my own position, the class I was born into, my geographical location, nationality, and so on and so forth, as an individual. But since you mentioned Bourdieu, who, as you said, was probably the social thinker contemporary, relative in terms of most committed to reflexivity, he emphasized not self-interrogation, which he thought was impossible. It's impossible to be perfectly honest about ourselves, but about our discipline and what he called the intellectual subconscious that goes into our categories of analysis and concepts, practices, and so on in the discipline. That should be the focus of science turning back upon itself.
Bourdieu's last published book is called Science of Science and Reflexivity, the last set of lectures he gave before his death. I'll work my way around, so over to Jennifer and I'll get a couple.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I think you're being too modest in using the term legitimate. Because we don't want a card that says I'm officially a legitimate political scientist. I don't want to be able to live in opposition with these people in an unspoken ghetto. You're giving us tools to help persuade people, to talk to people in the upper left-hand corner and say, oh, hey, look what I can do and how this is potentially bringing certain observations to the table that you might not know the methods. So there's a certain sort of politics of persuasion behind that. It's not just that we can all legitimately live in this broader science category together. We can have these debates with more at our disposal.
So a couple over here, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, it is really terrific what you did, and I have so many things to say in 1 minute. But four things. Quickly. I have a problem also with reflexivity, but people already talked about it. But when you started doing that, I thought, what is he going to put there? And I thought Hegel. But Hegel and reflexivity understood in today's terms is explicated by two different things.
Yeah.
Apples and oranges. I'm not sure if that works.
I think it's post-Hegelian. It derives from Hegel, but that's.
But I have a bigger problem, which takes me back to questions about hermeneutics and the way things started. Hermeneutics exists because of duality between the understandings of the world of the so-called natives and our researchers' understanding of the world. Right? The whole double hermeneutic dilemma, which is the essence of hermeneutics, is about some kind of dualism which doesn't fit. I'm not sure where it fits. But to me, it's the essence of what we're trying to do in the interpretive enterprise. And the final thing I would say is, one thing that you don't do, and you don't need to do that, but I find it very useful, is to think about the model of the human being that is assumed by each of those schools. And here, when you start thinking about it systematically, there are tremendous differences. Right? And I want to note what the useful terminological thing. When I studied philosophy, the distinction between phenomenalism of positivism and phenomena of phenomenology was tremendous. It's just enough to remember that Husserl was anti-positivist in order to create better science. Right?
I'll come back. There's something I want to say about that.
Yeah, I also just wanted to briefly get back to the issue, the takeaway message, the payoffs. Jennifer already sort of pointed into that direction, the issue of legitimacy. So you pointed out that you wanted to basically do two things: clarify our thinking, which I think you did a tremendous job with what you presented here, and then second, gain legitimacy. And there, I just see the problem that with this typology, or with this sort of clarifying our thinking, by definition, what we cannot do is gain legitimacy by one box. So if our target for gaining legitimacy is box one, neo-positivism, setting this up this way does not really get us anywhere. So what gets us somewhere is if we say, what are the grounds for gaining legitimacy? So they have to be outside of this somewhere. And these grounds for legitimacy, which then maybe allow us to agree to disagree, they have to be something else. And you could say these grounds should be our understanding of science, but I would argue that they're not, because otherwise we would be in a position of stronger legitimacy already.
But who funded our workshop?
So what
Seriously, who funded our workshop? Right? The NSF. Legitimacy may not ultimately have to do with arguments. Legitimacy may not have to do with persuasion. Legitimacy may have to do with institutional power.
Right. But I would also argue, and that's sort of what gets us from your introduction to the discussion of the workshop, is that what grounds for legitimacy in the end, or what should anyway in our field, is our interest in politics. And so it's what the legitimacy should be grounded on saying something that's Jennifer, I think, saying something meaningful and something interesting about the world and the political world.
And that exactly is why I'll say a couple things and then we'll go on. That exactly is why I think in many ways the ultimate take home here is that we need to have more work that teases these implications out, because it is not we're not philosophers, and fortunately we're not, because we don't get our clocks clean if we try to debate this with actual philosophers, because they have a whole different set of internal disciplinary debates that we're not privy to because it's not our discipline, it's not what we do. But we are trying to say intelligent, interesting things about politics. sort of the raison d'etre of the discipline. And if that's what we're doing, then what is required here is precisely more sets of work, right, to be able to do stuff. My main concern is that this partialized, inadequate understanding of science and methodology is so often used to just shut down all the interesting work, or work that I find interesting. Presumably that a lot of us find interesting, as far as here. And I don't want that to happen.
But is this a remedy? I mean, that's
right.
The danger that I see is that any neo-positivist could say, yeah, so what? It's a nice new way of organizing it,
but it puts them in one place, not in all of the places, and it doesn't have the sort of gravitational attraction that I think the quantitative explaining box does in that other way of sort of dividing things up. Which, you're right, doesn't show up in textbooks, but is, I think, implicit in a lot of the debates that are going on, that people are sort of conjoining these and thinking about this. And the whole goal of the qualitative methods people is to say, we can still explain, but we just don't do it with numbers. Right? So they're utilizing that, I think, for tacitly. So what does this do? I mean, I have the perhaps naive belief that calling attention to what I might irreverently refer to as the neo-positivism of neo-positivism, on the model of the whiteness of whiteness, might actually do something with maybe provoking people saying, hey, you know what, maybe there's something else going on here, maybe there are other alternatives to these things. I don't know about persuasion. I'm kind of skeptical of persuasion just generally. But in particular, I'm kind of skeptical.
Is it not politics?
No.
No, it's all power.
No, I think politics is coercion. But we can talk about that later. Because I think that because I'm operating in an intellectual realm, and these things are not actually thought out intellectually, they're thought out institutionally, which means they have practical logics associated with them, which are not necessarily reducible to the way. So this is a logical intervention into something that is itself not logical, right? But I think that so I'd be curious to see it. So I treat it as a kind of hypothetical. Let's see what happens as we start tossing these out there. I do not think that the net effect of this would be that someone who is a neo-positivist would pick this up and go, "Wow, I should do something different now." But maybe when the graduate student comes to them and says, "I want to do this," they could say, "That's really interesting. I can't help you with that." But this guy down the hall, who, because we hired this person, because in the debates we were having in the hiring committee, we were able to refer to the plurality of ways of doing science. We actually gave this guy an interview and decided we really liked him, so we hired him. Slowly, you end up with some space to be able to do stuff. There's a very specific reason why I don't do what you suggest in terms of talking about models of the man. Because again, I think that if we start talking about individual models of the human being that are implied by these different kinds of approaches, we lose the focus on methodology and we start getting into something else. Because then we start making substantive claims. This isn't substantive. This is all about form. This is all about the mind-world hookup and the ways in which we're connected to things. I want to try to focus on that precisely because the discipline is already so imbued with the idea that the empirical is what we should ultimately be doing. My whole goal here is take a step back, think about the tacit assumptions we're bringing to bear on our empirics before we go launch in to actually just start doing studies. So,
Patrick, I think you've succeeded in getting us talking.
Which is what I was doing.